Throughout this video, we will be discussing whether Eugene Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People has any relevance to our understanding of Britain during the early 19th century. Liberty Leading the People was Eugene Delacroix's way of making sure nobody ever forgot about the sacrifices made by the French people during the July Revolution of 1830. At this time, France was no stranger to revolutions. The July Revolution was caused after Charles X was made king. He passed many legislations that angered the French people and made bad choices when appointing ministers. This eventually led to an uprising on the streets of Paris, what would later be known as the July Revolution, which saw the end of Charles X's rule. Liberty Leading the People is inspired by the July Revolution in France, but could also be relevant to many other places at the time, particularly England, who were facing problems of their own. The English people were also beginning to realise that the system they were living under was outdated and was made to benefit only a few. Working conditions, particularly for the working class in both France and England, were extremely poor, which only added fuel to the fire. Politics at this time focused more on the individual rather than the people as a whole.
In Liberty Leading the People, Delacroix depicts a man in a top hat and a man in overalls charging side by side in the July Revolution in Paris. These two men represent the working and middle classes, coming together to fight their oppressors. This united force is comparable to the unification of the working and middle classes campaigning for political reform in Britain in the early 19th century. By 1830, there had been no political reform in Britain for nearly 400 years. The 1831 census states that Britain had a population of 24 million people. However, less than 500,000 people had the right to vote. Therefore, the House of Commons was not representative of the people. This was because, to be entitled to vote, you had to own a property worth 40 shillings or more a year. This meant that the voters were wealthy landowners or people with very high incomes. This meant that the working and middle classes were not entitled to vote and therefore did not receive representation in Parliament. For example, in 1831, the county of Middlesex had a population of 1.3 million people, but only 3,000 voters. Manchester had a population of 144,000 people, but no representation in Parliament. The inability to vote unless you were an extremely wealthy man demonstrates that Parliament was a system in favour of the autocracy. This is further evident by the existence of rotten boroughs, constituencies with little to no population but still benefited from representation in Parliament like industrial areas such as Manchester. In addition, not only was receiving representation in Parliament a benefit only for the wealthy, but the ability to become a representative was also reserved for those wealthy enough to meet the criteria. To be an MP, you had to earn £300 a year from land for a borough seat, or £600 for a county seat. This is further evidence that Parliament was reserved for the self-serving autocracy. The inability to vote and subsequent lack of representation resulted in injustices upon the working and middle classes, such as wage fluctuation. An example of wage fluctuation comes from early 19th century Manchester weavers. Cloth in the early 19th century was an expanding global market but extremely volatile. Therefore, merchants were extremely competitive and lowered costs by lowering wages. By 1808, weavers' wages had fallen by 60%, leading them to live in deprivation. In that year, 10 to 15,000 weavers congregated in a peaceful protest, unlike the portrayed violence of the July Revolution. The congregation in Manchester asked merchants to raise wages by a third to prevent starvation, but the protest failed. A desperate petition to Parliament requesting a minimum wage ensued, but also failed. Unable to vote, the protesters could not fight their case in the House of Commons. 8 years prior, a Weavers Association was formed in Manchester to push merchants and employers for better working terms and in addition, Parliament for legal protection. However, in the same year, the Suppression of Radical Societies Act was enforced, making it illegal to form such societies, and the Combination Act of 1800 that banned workmen from joining in trade unions was also introduced. Parliament's repeated quashing of the weavers' movements showed no regard for the starving population who were still living in squalor, illustrating that they were a self-serving government acting to protect the profits of the bourgeoisie. To combat the self-serving wealthy MPs, the radical working class and the moderate middle class campaigned for political reform. Parliamentary reformer Major John Cartwright created the first Hampden Club in 1812. The Hampden Club facilitated political debate and toured the country encouraging reformers to follow Cartwright's ethos and to unite the moderate middle class and radical members of the working class. Cartwright's agenda consisted of, but was not limited to, equal electoral districts that would see representation in industrial areas such as Manchester and not just rotten boroughs, the abolition of property qualifications for parliamentary candidates that would see MPs be more representative of the population and not just the self-serving upper class, and manhood suffrage. This would allow all men to vote, regardless of property and wealth, allowing workers such as the Manchester weavers representation. The Hampton Club was replicated across the country in places such as Manchester and Middleton. However, not all members agreed with the ethos of the club's founder, the main topic of debate being male suffrage. Some reformers shared Cartwright's belief in universal male suffrage. However, some members believed that only property owners should get the vote. This shows that although the working and middle classes united in their fight against their oppressors like the Mel and Delacroix painting, their unification was rife with differing beliefs and internal opposition. The Great Reform Act of 1832 saw the right to vote extended to the middle class men and the dismantling of rotten boroughs. The electorate rose by 40 to 50%. However, this was still representative of less than 8% of the adult population, demonstrating that Parliament still was not representative of the majority of Britain. Major John Cartwright's brother Edmund Cartwright also had a monumental impact on Britain in the late 18th to early 19th century. In 1785, Edmund Cartwright patented his invention, the power loom. The power loom mechanically sped up the process of weaving. The weaving process could now be done by machine, and human intervention was only required for repairs, making skilled artisan workers obsolete and cheaper labour paramount. By 1850, there was 250,000 power looms in Britain, of which 177,000 were in Lancashire, taking jobs from the Manchester weavers previously discussed. The creation of mechanised manufacturing that undermined skilled weavers created the Luddites movement. Luddites were skilled weavers who had spent their lives learning their craft but now felt that unskilled machine operators were stealing their livelihood. In protest, Luddites broke into factories and destroyed textile machines such as the power loom. This is reminiscent of the sabre-wielding artisan depicted in Delacroix's painting who was fighting for liberty and fraternity to protect his livelihood. Similarly to the painted artisan, the Luddites movement was met with oppression and violence. The government made machine breaking punishable by death, and occasionally gunfire was exchanged between soldiers and Luddites as they attacked factories. By 1813, the resistance was quashed, as thousands of soldiers gunned down, hung, or sent Luddites to Australia. The oppression of the Luddites movement is another example of the autocracy working to protect the bourgeoisie at the cost of the British people. In addition, the Luddites movement demonstrates the deadly ramifications of the government's suppression of Radical Societies Act, the Combination Act of 1800, the lack of universal suffrage and illegality of striking that insisted the only action that the Luddites could take was violence. The necessity for violence to fight against oppressors is evocative of Delacroix's depiction of the July Revolution. By 1823, it was claimed that children aged 14 to 15 could work 2 power looms and produce 3.5 times as much as the best hand loom weaver. However, even younger children were in the workforce. In 1810, 5% of workers in the cotton industry were under the age of 13, mostly orphans forced to work known as pauper apprentices. In 1819, the Cotton Mills Act was passed that prevented children under the age of 9 from being employed in cotton mills and introduced maximum working days of 12 hours for children under the age of 16. In addition, the Peels Act prevented pauper apprentices from working at night and entitled them to some education. However, as the men responsible for enforcing the acts were often friends with the factory owners, the rights of children were regularly ignored. Again, the wealth of the bourgeoisie was prioritised over the well-being of the British people. This is evocative of the child and liberty leading the people, as children in both Britain and France had their innocence stolen from them as they were forced to work and fight like adults.
When looking at the painting, the first thing our eyes are drawn to is the woman in the middle. This woman is the physical manifestation of liberty. Delacroix uses personification to make liberty more human-like, so more people can relate and try to understand the idea of it. Liberty is a symbol of an idea that led the revolutionaries, which is why she is at the forefront of the painting. With a gun in her left hand and waving the Liberty flag in her right, she is portrayed as strong and determined, leading all these people to freedom. Liberty is standing on a barricade surrounded by the dead, giving the idea that human sacrifice is giving liberty the opportunity to prevail. The figure of Liberty is seen wearing a gown which would then be associated with the proletariat woman, which would normally point to her being that of a lower class. But as we see throughout the picture, class has no meaning here in France. Unlike Britain, where the factory owners mainly sided with the Parliament, which we have already discussed, what would normally be seen as quite a modest dress for a woman to wear is turned into something else entirely, as Delacroix has painted Liberty with a torn dress revealing her breasts. This is portraying her in a less innocent light, but also showing us the struggles that revolution brings. She does, however, wear a Frisian cap, which was seen as a modest covering. This was also worn by women on the horrendous day in England which would later be known as the Peterloo Massacre, when hundreds of men, women and children were injured or killed when attending a peaceful protest for parliamentary reform in Manchester. The fact that the men attending the protest had brought their wives and children was the biggest indicator that violence was not expected. When women showed up in their white dresses and Frisian caps, people knew they had nothing to fear. They were the literal picture of innocence. This obviously wasn't the case when police rode in on the march and trampled these women with their horses. Just like Liberty, their dresses were torn, another time of great struggle for people wanting change. The way Delacroix has painted Liberty shows many conflicting ideas, showing her being both innocent and immodest alike. This idea links to the women in Britain at the time. The early 19th century was a time when women were still seen as the weaker sex. With that being said, women were beginning to very slowly branch out from the norms. It was the view back then that women should not work. However, industries like textiles were extremely reliant on women to carry out their work for them, due to the sheer amount of demand for these products. They were often known to employ women and children as they were cheaper to pay. Yet above anything, women were still seen as innocent, pure and more rational. This could be one of the main reasons why Delacroix painted Liberty as a woman, as it gives the idea that through all this violence there is still some form of innocence to be found. Eugene Delacroix does well at portraying the chaos and struggle that comes with revolution, whilst also showing us the excitement and energy it can bring as well. Just like in Britain, revolutions brought many struggles but also a feeling of hope for a better future. In the background of the painting we see the Notre Dame. This is symbolic of the French monarchy at the time, who was seen to have been given the divine right to rule by God. As we know, the July Revolution was a fight against the monarchy that was oppressing the French people. If this was a painting based on Britain in the early 19th century, we would have seen the Houses of Parliament in the background, as the British monarchy's power had been capped. It was capped in 1215 by the Magna Carta, which stated that the monarch must obey the law and withdrew some of the crown's power and gave it to the nobles. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 9 is also worth mentioning. This was after the tyrant King James II broke the social contract with Parliament. He was later conceded by King William III. King William's coronation came with the Bill of Rights, which moved power from the Crown and gave it to the Parliament, which no single person, including a monarch, could overthrow. This therefore moved Britain from a country ruled by the Crown, like France, to a democratically ruled country. This showed people that parliamentary reform was possible and that the power of the people is stronger than the people in power. We also see a lot of red, white and blue throughout the painting. Even the smoke is shining in those colours. Although these weren't the colours of the French flag at the time, it still portrays a sense of national pride. In Britain, there were still many people who were very protective of the monarchy. There were great tensions between the loyalists and the radicals, as loyalists still highly believed in traditional British values and had a huge amount of national pride. They believed in the system, whereas the radicals were tired of the system. They believed that all men should have a say in politics, regardless of class. This brings me on to the Burke versus Paine argument. This was about the relationship between the government and the people. Paine argued for the left. He believed in democracy and that people should be out for themselves, as he didn't think the government were representative of anyone who lived underneath it. His thought was that the government should come from the people, and if the government was corrupt, the people should have a right to overthrow it. Whereas Burke believed in the government and leadership, he also strongly believed in aristocracy. He thought power in government was a birthright. They disagreed on the French Revolution, as France's government had been around for a long time and came with many complications. Paine believed that change would only be brought about by revolution, and Burke thought that reform was the best way forward. He believed change took time. The problem with this in England was that the people were demanding more. They wanted a voice. They were changing, but the government wasn't changing with them. The Great Reform Act came around in 1932, which brought about great change in Parliament and how it was elected.
Delacroix's painting has permitted us to draw out similarities between France and Britain in the revolutionary period of the early 19th century. It has been shown that the people in both countries suffered at the hands of outdated systems to enhance their lives with the autocracy. The depiction of the July Revolution is evocative of the struggle of men, women, the working and middle classes who came together to fight for liberty and fraternity in Britain on the campaign for political reform.